Yeah, I'll just kick off by welcoming everyone. As I said a few minutes ago, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, feel free. If you have any burning questions that happen while others are speaking, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to kind of monitor that and refer back to it. I think there'll be a few more people joining, but we're at I think 24 now, so that's great. And yeah, the session will be recorded. It'll be edited down to the relevant parts and put up on the Community Economies Institute YouTube afterwards as well. And yeah, just try to keep your microphone on mute unless you're speaking. And yeah, Liviana is a very diverse and convivial gathering that happens over a couple of weeks every November. And in the spirit of that, it'll be great to open up the floor and have conversations happen. So anyone who's anyone who feels inspired to, feel free to chime in. We'll have time for a discussion at the end. I just want to maybe just set some context of I'm not sure if there has been a session on degrowth and diverse economies and community economies at Liviana before, but I thought I wanted to do it partly because I just saw this very intense crossover. Particularly, I went to my first degrowth, sort of international degrowth conference in Zagreb. And one of the things I noticed there was just that almost every session I went into was referring to the work of J.K. Gibson Graham or others from within the Community Economies Research Network. And there was just this very strong sort of presence of diverse economies thinking at that conference. And it was really one of the, well, yeah, it was definitely my most sort of, it was my favorite academic-ish conference experience that I've had. You know, it was really vibrant place with lots of fantastic economic ideas flying around. And yeah, and I just thought that these were communities that really are strong and growing, and it's worth sort of thinking through what they mean and how they could speak to each other. So my idea for this was really just to have some form of dialogue in whatever form people want to have in this space. So then after that, I recently had this small article. So I was thinking, okay, well, what are these sort of commonalities and what's causing this sort of crossover to be happening so strongly, and in what ways is it happening and in what ways is it not happening? So this came out a short while ago, and I just some of the similarities that I just wanted to talk about that are quite obvious to a lot of the people in the room, I'm sure, and will be that both of these communities are focused very much on decolonizing the imaginary, disrupting mainstream economic concepts of things like development, progress, growth. There's a very strong orientation in both of them towards commoning, the commons, and politics of surplus and how we deal with surplus. There's an appreciation of this diversity. So there's within degrowth as well, there's a lot of focus on sort of both market and non-market economic practices, and there's a lot of appreciation for the diverse economies iceberg and diverse economies thinking, and it comes through a lot in a lot of the literatures. And methodologically as well, that they're both extremely diverse, but they really, at their core, I think, have a strong element of action research and performative research. And then I also was trying to think through, okay, my own very biased and very personal perspective was that when I went into degrowth circles, there was a lot of discussion of diverse economies, but when I was in diverse economy circles, there was kind of less discussion of degrowth, or there wasn't really an understanding of how to relate to it. And yeah, this was just what I was thinking. So one of these things was that I tried to highlight was maybe around how we think of capitalism, and how we conceive of something that we might call a growth imperative in society, and what is a capitalist society, and questions like this. So I just wanted to leave those thoughts up there, and people can go back to that some other time. Jerry was in the audience and they had a discussion on this, so I would be very open to hearing thoughts that came up in this reading group around this paper, maybe critiques or ideas. And yeah, I'm just very open to thoughts on this. Yeah, and I think as communities of scholars and activists, there's a lot of parallels and there's a lot of change happening and there's a lot of growth happening and a lot of um, sort of deepening of connections through summer schools and institutes and Liviana, this sort of conference that we're part of now, but also degrowth conferences and a lot of success in funding and resources. And I don't know, there's just some of the things that cross my mind. This is a very sort of yeah, sort of schematic overview, but I just thought, okay, you've got these two vibrant communities, and then some of the questions that arise are, what are some of the things that CERN and degrowth communities can learn from each other as activist scholars? What resources are there, and what can they exchange or share? What alliances might exist? What differences? How to maintain a plurality of economic of discourses? So which terms we use in which contexts, which resonate in which contexts, which are appropriate. Yeah, and so I just want to sort of yeah, as part of this open conversation, I put out a call. Some people got in touch. I reached out to some people as well. So I'm really delighted that we have so Ben Schmidt from University of Freiburg. We've got Wendy Harcourt from Erasmus University. We've got Matt from University of Vermont, Matthew Burke, and Nadia Johannesova as well from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. I think in the audience, Borja also has some work that I think would be really interesting to reflect on. So if it's okay, I'm going to give space to these people to reflect on degrowth and diverse economies in their work and in their lives. Each of them will have up to 10 minutes, but I think it'll be less in most cases. And then after that, we'll open the floor. So yeah, if it's okay, Ben, do you mind if I sort of throw it to you maybe first, or would you like someone else?
I was afraid you're gonna do that, but I can start. Sure.
Okay.
I'll share my screen. There's a little drawing I just made before the session to try to reflect on how I'm using both kind of approaches, because I feel like I've been moving between those communities. I've never so I've been using a lot of degrowth literature and be inspired by it, and same with community economies. But it'd be really hard. I wouldn't like say that I belong to one of those communities more than the other. I wouldn't be able to decide between them. So I was thinking, what are the different inspirations that stick out? And can you see that, by the way, the drawing that I share? Okay.
Yes.
Uh, so I have to say that this is I'm not trying to like tease out any broad lines in terms of that's how those communities are, but more really my selective reading on and knowledge of what degrowth is to me and community economies is to me. So when I think about when I thought about degrowth earlier today, what is the main kind of association that I have with degrowth? It's really this positioning against growth-based development. So there is this element of antagonism. And I'm not sure, Tom, maybe you can say a little bit about this later, why you picked the term degrowth instead maybe of other terms such as post-growth. Of course, I guess this is the most widely used in terms of kind of like the institutional context, degrowth conference, a degrowth journal, and all of these things. But again, I think it's also maybe a specific message that it carries when we talk about degrowth instead of maybe other forms of, as I said, maybe post-growth. So to me, it really sticks out this element of turning against this idea of a growth-based development. And I think the strength that degrowth in how I'm aware of it, I'm using it really has is that it points out a lot of those mechanisms that growth-based economies are grounded in. I think you just dropped the notion of growth dependencies there, Tom. So these ideas, how do we kind of analyze economies, and how can we imagine alternative economic futures based on that analysis? What I think, and I'm just moving to the right-hand side and then coming back to the left-hand side to degrowth. So diverse economies to me is a little bit of a counterpart. So I turn to it and I associate it with a kind of imagining plural economic practices, and it's really this idea of reimagination. So I turn to diverse economies to kind of broaden the scope of thinking, to see the possibilities there are, which are already existing in the world, where things are already being done differently. And this is, of course, also where a lot of these things come together when we talk about degrowth and diverse economies, because, of course, these possibilities that are in the world are, of course, also relevant to kind of degrowth perspectives. But what I think that maybe sometimes, at least in my reading of the literature, sometimes is being missed out, and where I think there can be some possibilities for mutual learning, is that we look at degrowth, it sometimes kind of loses this or hasn't such a strong focus on the capacities that are already out there. There's a lot of degrowth literature with a very, I would say, rather maybe macroeconomic focus, and I think there's a good place for that, but it might miss out on kind of the capacities and agencies of actually practicing economies differently. And at the same time, I've talked about, so this is really kind of belongs together, talked about the mechanisms in kind of degrowth. What I think maybe sometimes is a little bit coming short in diverse economies literature is when we talk about what are the mechanisms in place that force or that exert a certain force on people to engage in specific practices, such as, for example, growth dependencies, which can be quite a strong, I guess, force for organizations, also individuals, but especially also institutions, to act in a specific way instead of maybe another way. And I think both are, to me, I see both discourses as kind of economic analysis that broaden and that work towards a broadening of possible economic futures. And I think they're both very inspiring in that. And I think where there's a lot of overlap is also when we talk about the practices that are being discussed in both in both discourses. It's often kind of place-based practices, as I said, maybe more strongly with diverse economies, but increasing also in degrowth, where there's about doing things differently, maybe prefiguring alternative futures. And I think there's a lot of inspiration to be drawn from examples from both of those literatures. And I think with kind of bringing this together and again, this is a very personal reading of both literatures. At least I try to do this in my own work, to really try to balance this perspective on, say, possibilities, on kind of alternative ways of doing, and at the same time, kind of underlying mechanisms and the ways that might explain why some things are the way they are and why it's so difficult to just kind of do them differently. And I think in this combination can be very strong in kind of working towards alternative futures, which I guess is ultimately a shared goal between both of those strands. So yeah, I think I keep it at that, just very rough and very personal, I would say, thoughts on this. And I'm looking forward to hear about how others make sense of these broad debates.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, I really like that figure. I'm amazed you just sort of drew it up right before the session. So if anyone has a question or something they'd like to clarify or something. So yeah, I think that's a really great way to start and a really good framing for the conversation. So yeah, Matt or Wendy, if one of you wanted to jump in now.
I maybe could jump in if that's all right, Matt. Just because I feel like I'm going to add, I really enjoyed that introduction, both of you. That was really useful, and thank you very much for having this session. I think I'm going to talk about it from a slightly different angle, perhaps. I've been involved in the degrowth community and the CERN community a bit, maybe more on, I don't know, on the margins or something. I've been in dialogue and engaged and written, but really coming from a feminist perspective. So I wanted to draw out what I saw as some of the dialogues I've been having in conversation within degrowth conferences or teaching, or also within different community economies spaces. But what I'm really interested in is how care is central to both of these conversations. Interestingly, neither of you mentioned that, but I think that's something to me that is really what draws me to them. So how to actually promote care if we're talking about futures, to post-capitalist economies, but also different forms of commons, and how we want societies to flourish. So I really think an ethic of care is central to community economies thinking, the idea of how we can transform economies that allow for both human and also more than human communities to survive well together. And I see that at the heart of a lot of the discussions, but also the practices around community economies. And at the same time, I would also say that in degrowth, there's also a lot of emphasis on care and care concerns as part of that also imagining of how we can flourish in different life worlds. So for me, I saw that as something connecting them. And I would really like to hear more discussion about how that can happen. I think that's got very material implications for that, not only theoretical in the sense that it's really about how we change our relations to food and energy and housing, and all the sorts of material world concerns around well-being and equity or whatever, sustainability. And for me, I think there's a real need to see care as a radical embodying of really deep change, which I see both degrowth and community economies wanting to do, but how actually we do that. And this idea of care for me is something that is what's happening, needs to happen now. But yet it's one of these labors which has been so easily overlooked when we're talking about political and social change. So in that sense, I see feminism as really contributing to this kind of vision of the importance of care, and particularly learning from Indigenous peoples and communities in the Global South. I know many of you in this room have been looking at that. But I see the need to really foster that dialogue much more clearly as something that is both about on the ground practices in local communities, but also about how we want to see the futures. So I just wanted really to raise that issue. I don't think it's actually a very easy dialogue because there's a lot of unequal power and privilege in as we talk about care. I mean, who is doing the caring, and the ways in which we can understand that is something I think we need to pay more attention to in both the community economies and also in degrowth, particularly when we're talking about, whose needs are we really looking at? And I still think that feminists have a lot of important questions there about care work being marginalized, racialized, and in different ways. And I think that's something that I was part of the group that organized the Hague Conference on Caring Communities. And it was something we found very difficult to bring in, the sort of understanding of care as central value in terms of also theorizing it when people were so focused on different forms of economies. So I think the community economies can really add to that. Yeah, I've been writing a bit about this, so I'm going to stop there because I feel I could go into a lot more. But I just wanted to as in the interest of dialogue, put that in as a question to both the community economies, but also the degrowth communities, how we can dialogue around care more seriously, if you like. So, and thanks, Tom, again for organizing the session.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Yeah, that's a really important point. Eva, I see a comment. Is there any interest in just clarifying that one from 2-tier to 1-tier ones as discussed by many. Sorry, just. As it related directly to what Wendy was talking about.
Hello. Sorry, I'm here with family stuff, talking about care. So I was just absent. I don't need to take the floor now, and so I just heard my name and a reference to the comment. So, but
yeah, sorry, I was just wondering if you wanted to deepen on your thoughts in relation to what Wendy was saying.
Yes. So this is for instance, ecofeminist degrowth, or other political economists have suggested, who have a Marxist background, to highlight the fact that instead of working first for money and then using the money for the basic needs, then why not to actually work for the actual basic needs? So this is the principle, and I think a lot of the diverse economies theorizing goes along the same lines, complicating the labor and exchange and so forth. Yes, also the family sounds for you, brought to from Finland.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll just leave it open if anyone else wants to jump in on what Wendy was talking about. That would be great. Otherwise, we'll just move on. And Matt, are you okay if I give you the floor?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Tom, for organizing and everyone for being here. Yeah, so what I'll be speaking to concerns the relationship between degrowth and diverse economies, community economies as relationship to place, and how they both have an orientation to place that could help to bring these communities together, both in research and practice. It's more of a dialogue. I haven't done a lot of work yet trying to do this. I have noticed, though, in a lot of the work, the critique around degrowth, that maybe which is more of the direction that I'm coming out initially, that there's often less attention to really living in radically different ways. So really centering sort of diverse ways of living that emerge out of place. And by ways of living, like we can talk about lifeways, livelihoods, cultures, but radically different ways of being and living in the world. So about me, so I'm based at the University of Vermont, where I'm research faculty with a department, community development and applied economics. I do have some background in community economies. I've been getting more connected with folks in that work of late, and then especially degrowth. Maybe 10 years or so ago, as a graduate student doing some work here at UVM, where there's a strong ecological economics, but within that there's a strong and growing focus on degrowth. We've had some conferences and continue to bring people together around some of these issues. And as degrowth in some ways is being taken up more generally, it's also had to respond to a number of concerns, and those concerns are frequently and repetitively kind of brought up again, and so there's always an opportunity to try to sharpen and clarify what degrowth is, what it means, what it doesn't mean. These types of debates are going to be ongoing, but also as degrowth or related ideas become more widely understood, then there's an opportunity for it to sort of shift from some of its original motivations too. So those are some of the concerns, I guess, that I'm responding to. So really just 3 points I think I wanted to make, in addition to speculating a little bit more based on, Tom, what you've shared and others in terms of how degrowth and diverse economies might be mutually supportive in some sense. So basically what I want to say is first that degrowth itself means more than just downsizing economies. And then secondly, that suggests that degrowth means requiring more attention to how to live in particular places. And then living in place then is what I'm suggesting implies a deep and profound diversity of ways of living in the world. So I'll just briefly speak to each of those. In the first case, the one of many important and common critiques charged at degrowth is that it sort of assumes that more or less things can stay the same. I mean, it's a concept that has grown out of the so-called global north. Here we're speaking primarily, I think, to communities in North America and in Europe, which I think of where most of the degrowth has been demonstrated and raised as a concern. That's where a lot of the degrowth work has come out of. There's been a concern then that degrowth can somehow reduce the size of or the scale of the economy, reduce GDP, reduce throughput, but more or less social patterns, social relationships, ways of living can remain about the same. Or maybe that's just not given enough attention. This is one of the concerns that is often raised. And I think degrowth, if you really are looking at the work that's come out of it, especially recently in the past 5+ years, have responded pretty consistently that that's not the case, right? It is much more of a profound shift in the way of living and being in the world. There's always this concern then, as well, as degrowth the right word for what we're talking about? I'm going to set that one aside. Maybe that'll come up at another point. But just to indicate here that what I'm interested in about degrowth is its opportunity to consider how we can live differently, not just smaller, in terms of economic scale. And so secondly, then, if we're to really take seriously that living differently, that requires a deep attention to certain places of particularities, the history, the context, the culture, the language, the ecology. All of these factors really become much more important when you're considering this sort of degrowth and diverse economies trajectory. So I do feel like strengthening an attention to place, and of course this has come up in a number of folks' work, but strengthening attention to place and the unique qualities of place can help shift away from that sort of initial focus on quantity. It's much more of a qualitative shift. So we can see this in terms of certainly in materials, of energy, of sort of a relocalization, community economies, but also in terms of currency, in terms of communications. That was an earlier session today, restoration and care work and so on. All of these have a strong place orientation if they're really to endure and thrive over the long term. And so then lastly, living in place then does imply really a flourishing of diversity of different ways of living. And those different ways of living really need to reflect those differences of place, that sort of qualitative shift and that we've been talking about. So I'll just close by maybe a couple of points that how I feel like especially the diverse economies can contribute to degrowth, and I'm focusing on that way because we're talking about here at the University of Vermont really trying to further develop a hub in some sense of around degrowth, and I feel like this community, as that develops, could really benefit from the work in Community Economies Research Network, Diverse Economies, and so on. But of course, my intent would be that these communities are sort of mutually enriching. I think that's what the premise of this session is about. So certainly, how can they achieve that? So certainly around praxis, the actual application of theory to these certain places. Again, responding to the concern that degrowth is primarily a matter of decreasing economic scale. This is not the case, but I think degrowth can be a lot more explicit about the diverse practices, diverse theory around ways of living. Also methods, the community economies, diverse economies, community broadly, I think has put a lot of, rightfully so, put a lot of attention to methods and concerns around methodology. The handbook from 2020, Gerda Rolvink speaks to place-based nitty-gritty research in terms of really understanding sort of a place-based orientation in the methods. So certainly action research, but also the various analytical approaches that are used in diverse economies for investigating labor, production provisioning, property finance, and so on. All for a place-based economy that's not dependent on unending growth to flourish. I think politics is another point where they could be mutually reinforcing, especially in the current context. Both degrowth and diverse economies, I would say, have faced charges of not being political enough. And I think they both can sort of address that and learn from one another and maybe share some of maybe a more explicitly post and anti-capitalist position. And I think, Tom, some of that in your paper you were addressing. So maybe we can come back to that. And then finally, scale. By scale, when I'm talking about getting, scale is often considered as sort of a getting smaller, and both have also had to fend off concerns that they really only apply to small scales. And to some degree, that's likely to continue, but I think it's also worth asking how we need to reimagine scale towards a deeper understanding of how to live in place. So it's not just about getting smaller, but really going deeper into a place. And then this deepening is likely to enable a flourishing of the social and economic difference that I think we all realize we require. And then I've got a bunch of other examples I could point to make all of this a little more concrete, but maybe I'll save that for the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. It's really rich as well. Yeah, there's lots of resonances, and yeah, I'm learning a lot as we go along. Would anyone like to have any questions for Matt before we move on, just specifically around what he contributed? So if not, yeah, I might pass to Nadia. And I know, for example, Nadia, you sort of have a long-standing relationship with degrowth circles, and yeah, maybe we could talk about how that came about and your relationship with community economies, and yeah, how whatever resonates from the conversation so far.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Well, yes, hello, I'm Nadia. I'm from the Czech Republic. I'm based at Masaryk University, and I became interested in economic issues after the regime change in my country, when I found that there was an economic ideology seeping in after communism. And I became sort of interested in critiquing this economic ideology, and at the same time looking for alternatives. There's a saying by Paul Robbins, a political ecologist, that if you want to change a system, you need both a hatchet an axe sort of and a seed. You have to be able to critique what is happening around you somehow and suggest ways to change it, and at the same time to grow new things, which the second thing is what many of you have been speaking about, growing new ways of being, new economies, more giving more importance and centrality to care and to place. And I like that very much. And later, I became so I also became interested in alternative economies and all sorts of ways of different economic solidarity economies and so on. And then Degrowth came along in 2010 when I learned about it. I also came to a conference, and I was really, it was great because suddenly everybody was saying that growth is not a good idea, which was wonderful. And it was what we've been feeling, what I've been saying all along, so that was great. And then even later I learned about community economies, and now I'm a part of CERN because it seems like a good home, a sort of very tolerant place to discuss things and to understand things. But I haven't been following all of the literature, so whatever I'm going to say is really also subjective, just as Ben was saying. Well, what I feel the two directions. Oh, I forgot to say that Tim Crabtree, who is also here from South England, was an important influence and is an important influence in my life, and his independent thinking, again, long before degrowth and community economies influence, this has been important for me. Well, anyway, so I think what the two directions have in common, degrowth and community or diverse economies, is a kind of liberating feeling that you need to. Degrowth speaks about reimagining the reality, changing the imaginary, looking at the world differently, and similarly, community economies, diverse economies speak about seeing the other economies which are there behind the capitalist screen, which we are told is the only thing that exists really, but it doesn't. So we have to look at, and as Wendy said, in my opinion, also very importantly, indigenous economies, which I'm actually looking at the moment. I find them very inspiring in looking at Nayakrishi in Nayakrishi Andalon in Bangladesh, or the Sangha tradition in India, and Peruvian potato park. So I'm very excited about these things right now. We've been working with Tom on some case studies of these indigenous practices. But anyway, so what I think they both have in common is the sort of saying about let's look at the world differently. We have to change our imaginary. We have to change our ontology, the way of looking at the world. What is important? So that's great, and I really agree with that. And what I think is sort of sometimes missing in both, actually, in degrowth and community economies, and what I think Matthew Berg has also mentioned, that they are being criticized for not being maybe political enough. So in my parlance, I would say that sometimes the hatchet is missing and the seed is there, but I feel we do need to critique in both directions, or in both degrowth and community economies, to look at the machine actually, which is there, and which ignoring it doesn't mean it will go away. In the book by Gibson Graham and Stephen Healy, and called Take Back the Economy, they are speaking of that we should see the economy rather as a garden than as a machine. But actually the machine is also there, and so I think that we have to keep up this tension between looking at the new and for sort of supporting the new, what is growing, not only new but was old and not seen before, because it was considered that it's not progressive and so on, such as some traditional practices which may be inspiring, are inspiring. But we also need to say out loud, well, the growth machine won't go away if we stop thinking about it. And we need to, I think both directions should sort of critique more. The political ecology might be an inspiration there, looking at the power structures and not looking away from them, and critique more loudly, look at policies, for example, about the growth imperative. I think Ben also mentioned it, the pressure to grow, which is in the system, and also the ideology of free trade, which I think should be critiqued much more, which is something that the powers that be are very, it's supposed to be sort of, I see it every day here in politics. It's supposed to be the way to go. It's the only way. We need to sort of be more competitive and so on. So I think both directions would profit from, or should perhaps look at more at this political side and sort of look at into the face of the machine and try to challenge it. So I think that would be my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Yeah, I'll just leave some space if anyone wants to reflect on anything directly that Nadia said. So yeah, just keep mulling over questions or comments, or if there's anything coming to mind, and throw it in the chat. Ben, you have your hand up. Sorry, Ben and Anissa, I don't know who had theirs first, but
I've already spoken, so Anisha, you can go first.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for your presentations and really generative thinking. Degrowth is not an area that I've worked in at all or familiar with, but I guess I was thinking about, you know, what Benedict you raised right at the beginning, and Nadia has just sort of brought back into the fore of, you know, the forces or mechanisms that impinge on our capacities to enact different kinds of economies. You know, and thinking about that at a really granular level, about how power relationships and structures of power impinge on certain constituencies, you know, much more and differently than others. And I guess I'm kind of interested in like sort of practical or strategic questions about scale as well that Matt, you know, you were raising, and I'd like to hear more about, yeah, this idea of a deeper understanding of scale in relation to place-based livelihoods. The project that I've just started working on for my postdoc is about transforming regional food governance in New England. And so there's this idea that thinking with the region or using a regional approach could be a very productive way to very practically and strategically think through how we enact and coordinate our diverse economic activities. And I just wanted to put that out there as a sort of a question as well. And of course, there's questions about what do we mean by the region, what do we mean by governance, thinking about both of those from a very pluralistic perspective, you know, in terms of like a bioregion, or, you know, it could be state territorial region, could be other ways of thinking about the region, or a region, and then thinking about governance in a very diverse sense as well, you know, whether it's the laws and policies that might, you know, we might need to challenge, or that are suppressing, you know, our attempts to live differently, or it's norms and cultures, or it's different kinds of ways of governing, you know, whether that's indigenous ways of governing, ethical principles and things like that. Not very coherent, but just some thoughts that I want to share and throw out to the group for discussion. Thanks.
thanks so much, Anissa. And Ben?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad that you went first. So I guess it's I think you I share a lot of similar thoughts, and Nadia, thanks for pointing out this what I tried to capture with this idea of antagonism, or as you said, critique, and I think this is really important. And I think it's really helpful to also bring in, as Anissa did, the idea of strategy. And I think this is something that degrowth has been taken up lately, like in the last few years, a lot. But I think there can still be done a lot more in terms of thinking how can we, and this again also ties to this idea of scale. How can we bring this into practice, and what does it mean across different scales? Of course, within kind of place-based practices, but how can kind of place-based actions also be transformative at various scales? And of course, not just in terms of different levels of governance, but if we rethink scale, as Matthew said, how would we need to capture ideas of scale to think strategically about the role of place-based practices in broader transformation? I think, and there again, we can draw a lot of inspiration from diverse economies thinking, because it allows us, I guess, to reimagine a lot of what could be also the potential of place-based practices within broader economic relations. So I think like bringing these labels together, and then last but not least, also this idea of policy, which of course it's always very uncomfortable because it has a lot of kind of like compromise and ambiguity often attached to it, to think about what other types of policies that might be possible, but would further some of those ideas of alternative futures, and at the same time, often those policies that are being implemented or are kind of it seems to be a potential that they're being implemented, they might be very kind of ambivalent from these critical perspectives. So I think again at the end, it very much is this tension between reimagination, but at the same time critique or antagonism. And I think this is a tension that can be very productive if we kind of keep it alive instead of trying to overcome it, because I don't think it can be overcome. But this kind of again brings you back to the point I've been trying to make earlier, that this to me is can be a very productive tension, and it's always at play when I think about kind of how these two discourses can maybe further transformative imaginaries.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And so one thing we could do is related to that question of politics and strategy and struggles. Borja, do you mind if I bring you into the conversation at this point? So I think this is a nice example of these communities as well. So I think Borja has been very centrally involved in various degrowth initiatives in and around Barcelona, but also attended the Community Economies summer winter school a couple of years ago, and has sort of utilized a lot of community economies thinking, diverse economies thinking in his work on fisheries and in the Mediterranean and other questions, but now is working on something a little bit different. So Borja, I think it would be great to hear from you about what's going on in Girona, and yeah, I'll leave you the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is great. I'm so happy that I could join. As said, my work really focuses more on like blue degrowth or degrowth on the marine and coastal realm. And in that vein, I engaged in the community economies, diverse economies perspective a bit, also by attending the summer school, as mentioned, and also working together with Dr. Kevin San Martin at Rutgers. And I'm kind of continuing in working on that academically, but yeah, and what I found that could be interesting for the discussion is that now more on the practical side, let's say, on trying to apply degrowth theories and yeah, and concepts to a specific case, which is the case of the Girona city, one of the major cities in the Catalan region, located on its northern part, about an hour and a half away from Barcelona, which since a year and a half ago has a quite progressive government. Yeah, like basically we were invited particularly by the climate action counselor or the environmental counselor to help them develop a plan for the city to transition, have an eco-social transition in a post-growth direction, basically. So quite a humble enterprise. But what's interesting really is that what has happened is like that the city hall has been very wholeheartedly giving us access to the people working in the city hall, like getting to know the city hall pretty well, and also engaging with them in thinking through what could be done, what can cities do, or what if the municipalism in that sense makes sense from a degrowth perspective. And well, we are approaching it from different areas. One is kind of the critique that has been mentioned already. So a bit of like seeing what is the machine here is like, consider we talk about the growth machine, you know, what are the dependencies that tie municipalities and cities in their budgets, you know, in their spending, in all what they can offer and what they cannot, trying to understand that better, also in the hopes to seeing which are the holes, which are the places where that could be rearranged somehow. So that's been one work that we've been doing, but I think for two points of connection that have been mentioned in the discussion so far, that of care and place, have been also in my mind very much in trying to think, okay, how can we do this here? You know, how can it make some sense of what we are doing? Of place, well, clearly enough, then our focus here is the city and also the effects, the more immediate effects of the city, and trying to also to, in terms of language, you know, what are people in this place, what would be their desires when we talk about a transition to a post-growth or to following a degrowth path, what are their desires and their fears or their kind of their alliances as well, no, their their realities, their daily lives, and the other is of course care. That for me, what it's interesting about this challenge, I see it as a big challenge, is like we came there and, you know, focusing on, you know, issues of energy or like waste or water, even transportation were kind of the go-to places, and there were the areas of the city hall that there was more of an understanding that, okay, these guys come here to do kind of a very socially sensible sustainability, but in the end is sustainability, no, and environmental stuff. But to me, I found it like very like really wanting to explore, okay, if degrowth is about, yeah, bringing the social metabolism back into, you know, the levels of the biosphere, you know, bringing that environmental sustainability while improving well-being. How can these things be done at a city level? You know, what does well-being look like at the city, and how could be done in a more or less short time or medium time frame? And there I came with the question of care, of course, and to me, one things that we are thinking to explore and wanted to explore is like seeing how questions, how to tie in this kind of project, in this kind of transition, initiatives of community health and particularly community mental health, of like direct or also kind of sort of self-organized communities of caring around these issues, could be reinvigorated through being brought into discussion with questions of sustainability or eco-social transition and this kind of stuff. And that also comes from from the question of place, in the sense, because in Spain, public health is in quite a dire moment, but particularly mental health or like emotional health, if you will. Publicly speaking, or like the public offering of this is non-existent, basically. But there is a clear sense by most of us that there is a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in that type of realm. So we felt that this could be an interesting entry point that we're looking into, and that I was very eager to see, you know, clearly for me that was kind of a community economies, very much perspective, while also coming from a degrowth analysis. And that's what I wanted to share, and also like to bring this case, the resting case, to the table in case people want to engage more and want to know more further on from this conversation, I would like more, community economies people getting to know this and to interact with us. So thank you so much for all the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Boran. Can I follow that up with a question? Anissa says she'd like to know more, and can I just ask, like, the background of that work, the underlying, is there a lot of preparatory work that went on in the city that led to that sort of change in government or change in local policy, local municipal government, and how does that actually come about? So to be invited in like that and to start that work, what to have it so sort of unconditionally, to be willing to even use the term degrowth or something like that in that context.
Well, to the surprise of no one, I assume the kind of the winning coalition, because it's a coalition actually, but even the main party wasn't running on a degrowth platform for their campaigns. The fact that such a type of political organization could get into it is a bit contextually based, also because it ties in with the Catalan-Spanish question. So this is a coalition of pro-independence Catalan parties that goes from the center-right or liberal right to the center-left or social democrats, and the main party is more of a left-wing, most unabashedly pro degrowth party, and particularly the people in the environmental section. The work that came in, I mean, it was more of a trying to, do sort of political work that is very much based on the streets, on getting to know the local realities, the local problems, and trying to be, while not losing the sight of, the big debates, be it, it's an anti-capitalist party. So of course they call about abolishing capitalism and all the rest, but in the end, they focused on the city and the problems of the city. And I think that's what got them a popularity. And same with degrowth, we call about, whatever, planetary boundaries and all that stuff. But in the end, it's like, okay, how does this look for Girona, and how does this affect, good or bad, to the people living here? So yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Ava says, to me, it also seems that degrowth and diverse economies should be theorized connected to the ground. The downside is that the diversity makes it difficult to have a common ground with proponents of techno-rational systems, emphasizing exponential economic growth, and also puzzled how to get funding for this type of research when reviewers might favor universal theories over place-based ones. Yeah, Anissa, you have your hand up, I think? Or...
Well, not specifically on degrowth, but it just reminded me of work that's being done on agroecology. So agroecology as a process, as a science, as a practice, as a political movement, has kind of principles that you can work with, but how those principles are operationalized or worked with are very place-based, right? Every context is different. So it sort of made me think of that type of relationship where maybe, and I think lots of work is being done on this, of thinking about the principles or methodological approaches to diverse economies and degrowth that then can be elaborated through grounded empirical case studies. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but it did draw a parallel in my mind with agroecology and food sovereignty.
Yeah, Matt, I was going to say that this could be good. Also, you mentioned some of the work you're doing in Vermont, and maybe there's something you could say about that.
Yeah, well, I was thinking to Nadia's point about Robin's hatchet and seed metaphor. I think food sovereignty is a great example of that. I mean, we're seeing that locally, and many other parts of the world that are organizing around food sovereignty are explicitly, on the one hand, resisting or fighting those systems that are preventing that sort of local food system from developing or regional food system from developing, which are significant, right? Those are significant power structures. And at the same time, trying to really allow the local conditions to, including culture, but certainly ecology, to renew or reimagine practices for providing for basic needs and food relevant to whatever region we're in. So I think that's a great example. There are other examples too. In fact, my colleague here at UVM, Josh Farley, has been working with some of our students to convert lawns to perennial food systems. And I think that's also another fantastic example of the way like a lawn system has kind of monoculturally taken over our many collective imaginations, and then people through very, very grounded work trying to reimagine what it would mean to not only provide for themselves, but for their neighbors and their families and their communities and their neighborhoods. And there are other examples too. I mean, Vermont, in some sense, because it's been in some ways an economic backwater outside of a lot of the main economic power centers, there has been now for a couple of generations, going back decades, a lot of experimentation, sort of place-based experimentation, and that we're still benefiting from that. Whether it shows up in childcare, whether it shows up in different schools, whether it shows up in very rich ecosystem of food cooperatives. I mean, community health centers. I could go on and on with these sort of real world manifestations of these practices in this region. I wanted to really quickly touch on this question of strategy, though. I think one of the things that's been interesting to me, learning with and through the Community Economies network, is this idea that communities don't just exist out in the world, that they're really brought together and emergent through relationships and engagements, and that includes through research, right? So we're not researching a community. In some sense, a community is an aspect of what comes out of our engagement through research. And so thinking in terms of strategy, and maybe this relates to one of the comments in the chat, how are we, through our own work, developing those sort of alliances strategically in a particular place? And this is a question we've had to grapple with through a project where we're trying to conduct research that has a strong watershed, maybe bioregional focus in the Champlain Valley. We're asking ourselves now, you can't work with everyone, and you don't need to, but you do need to think sort of creatively and strategically about those relationships that you're committing to and depending on, and really centering through your research work. So this is place-based work that is really, I think, strategic in the approach that we're trying to develop in terms of our alliances, our relationships, and the communities with whom we're going to work. Check. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Matt. There's a lot of activity in the chat that I'm trying to monitor, and there's lots of great resources being shared, and papers and calls for papers and comments in general. Peter, is it okay if I just call on you and ask you to, so I don't just read it?
Sure, yeah. I had a PhD student looking at degrowth in the concepts of Irish planning. And he specifically liked the idea of using degrowth as a missile concept to specifically say to, you know, technocratic planners, look, you can't go on like this. You need to do something different. And the sort of the more consensual, diverse economies way of looking at things, he felt could be too easily sort of streamlined into something that is called sustainable development and doesn't actually challenge, you know, the beast that we need to challenge. I'm never convinced by that, particularly in Liverpool. I don't think it works. You know, people say to me in Liverpool, well, how can you be against growth? And I like the idea of, you know, diverse economies, say, you know, queering the idea of an entrepreneur, queering the idea of growth. I just find it's more generative, although I have written a paper where I've argued for the place of antagonism in diverse economies, and I sort of stick by that. I just wonder what people thought about that, because I'm on the fence.
Ben, would you? I named this session "Degrowth and Diverse Economies," but I could have, I guess, very easily just, even though there's different connotations and things, it's a term I cling to. It's a personal preference I have for something that is perhaps difficult to co-opt or to, yeah. I don't want to elaborate too much on that, but Ben, you said you prefer post-growth, and maybe you can respond to Pete.
Yeah, it's really difficult because I'm always I think, and like I added this to the response. I do prefer post growth if I have to choose one term, but then it just might be also a matter of context. Who do you talk about? In what context are you? What is your goal? What is the strategy? Because I think I just feel like even at academic conferences where you would think that people may like read up on when they use degrowth or when they oppose it, which often happens, that they are familiar with what is behind the term, and there's so many misunderstandings that it's really difficult to engage in meaningful conversations. So I have moved towards being very strategic of what terms. Sometimes I completely avoid either degrowth and post-growth. Sometimes I generally use post-growth if I don't know what audience do I speak to or what people do I speak to. It's just, but I do think there is like a good argument about this like difficulty to capture the term degrowth. But if you end up having a discussion on, like, as I think Matthew, you outlined the kind of like common misunderstanding of like we talk about recession and we leave everything else as it is, and of course this is not what degrowth is about. So it's just like so many misunderstandings. And I've been recently doing a little bit of work with the concept of donut economics, and they again use a completely different framing about being agnostic to growth, which I again think is a little bit problematic because it allows to, like, it leaves too much space allowing for growth to continue, or growth-based development to being seen as something that we could continue. But at the same time, it has sparked a lot of interest in kind of like actual cities implementing the concept. And the research I've done and people I've talked to often point towards that, like leaving open the question of growth and not using concepts like degrowth is one of the key ingredients for this communicative strategy, that it actually worked out that the concept was taken up. So long story short, I think it's a very strategic choice, and there's like merit in taking, like using each of those concepts and terms.
Eva.
Hello, change of locations. Yes, I wanted to bring up the notion of capitalism into the discussion. Since already in the degrowth community, while I think majority would consider themselves, or they work to be critiquing capitalism, there are some who are maybe more growth capitalism agnostic. So if you have a take on this debate, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I think in the paper that I mentioned in my presentation, it was that there was a shift in degrowth, post-growth discourses over the last sort of 15 years, where at the beginning there was a lot more debate around an openness to what it even means when we speak about capitalism, and then that over time that the discourse sort of, for maybe for practical reasons or strategic reasons, or just to spark conversations, or and I think it has worked in a lot of ways, that it sort of has hardened or crystallized over the time in terms of knowing, for example, knowing that capitalism is the dominant mode of economy in a certain geography, and then that is something, so therefore that's something easier to sort of to build up and then kick against, and to build a sort of a movement around. Whereas that might be problematic for from another perspective. So yeah, Anissa, I think you have a comment there related to that, I think. If you want to contribute anything else, and Wendy wants to contribute.
Wendy, you go.
Okay, thanks, Anissa. No, I was I'm very aware that, yeah, it used to be very controversial, the concept of degrowth, but in the end now it's got a lot of funding. As Tom pointed out, it's become very successful, which is slightly problematic to some extent. So I think the question about it being political is actually the important one. Here in the Netherlands, I mean, regularly people are invited to Parliament to discuss degrowth. It doesn't actually go anywhere, but it's there. We now have courses on degrowth, which are exciting, but they're being brought into the curriculum. So I think it's good to keep the anger and I've got to, sorry, this is my dog joining into the anger here. But I think it is super important that we don't lose sight of the huge challenge it's meant to be to the capitalist project. And sometimes I'm concerned that it's yeah, becoming a buzzword, even if it's a critical one or one that people will debate, etc. But for me, that's important. And if I could just mention, I mean, I'm living and working in the global north, obviously, but there are also a lot of conversations about like who can degrow, and from the global south perspective, there's other terms and other ways that we can connect. So I think, for me, Escobar's pluriversal approach to this could be one that we could really listen to seriously. And I'm very aware of that right now with COP going on in Azerbaijan, and the kind of yeah, and all the political arenas that we're going to have to face. I think degrowth has to keep its anger and its politics much more stridently, I would say. I also agree community economies is working in place. I think what Matt's saying is really important. I don't think it ever did. In a way, the political imaginary that's there is a very different one. Degrowth, I think, sets out to go to the heart of capitalism in a very clear way. In a sense, I mean, you can all disagree with me, but I see community economies, it's a research network. It's got it's positioned in place. It's doing lots of things, but there's no universal kind of attack there. I mean, it's got much more of the pluriversal approach, which I think is good, but it's a research network. I mean, degrowth set itself out to be practice, to be political. That's also where it's at. I don't know if people agree with me, but that's what attracted me to degrowth, was the politics behind it. And I think it's getting lost with all this, with all the funding and all the courses that you can do on it. Thank you. Sorry if that was a bit of a rave, but anyhow, why not?
No, thank you, Wendy. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? I also see Jeff's comment. If you want to expand on this, or again, it's quite long, so it may be better that you sort of explain it, or we can take time to read it. It's up to you.
Yeah, well, first, let me say I apologize for being super late and tardy. No excuse for that. And also for the poor quality of my camera. That's a technology issue. My point really is that I always push back on this notion of being an anti-capitalist or anti-capitalist whenever I reference degrowth. For a lot of folks, even some of the smartest folks that I've worked with in the world of sustainability, push back on this, and I have to go to some great lengths to point out to them that I'm not an anti-growth. Coming at from an anti-growth perspective, I'm really looking at quality growth that is not necessarily dependent on carbon-based fuels in order to get us there, and is certainly not based on GDP as the only or the primary measure of growth. What I point out is that, again, I consider myself a multi-capitalist rather than an economic capitalist solely. And I think if we frame capitalism in that broader construct, not even restricting it to 3 categories, but perhaps 5 or even 6 capitals, then I think it helps us better understand that growth is not a bad thing. It's a natural thing to some degree, certainly from a human perspective. But at some point, we're limited. That's why we typically don't end up being 15 foot tall and generally getting beyond 80. So we are limited. And so I kind of frame it that way. But generally, I think the other piece about degrowth, from my perspective, is the imbalance that we see around the distribution of wealth, which largely decades-long institutionalized perspective of just a single version of capital, economic capital, and which is largely driven by colonialism, and now neocolonialism through corporates. And so I think that's part of what I'm attempting to convey when I speak to folks about degrowth. And I'm fairly agnostic when it comes to degrowth or post-growth. I could go either way, flip of a coin, frankly. I hope that helps.
No, thanks so much. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nadia, do you mind if I bring you in on this a little bit? I also just briefly reflect that we've been writing together, and we also had this comment. I don't know if you remember. Just there was a document online, and we sort of said, okay, well, do we even need to be? The book has a subheading around growth or non-growth, and we were wondering whether we even, like, there's so many other terms we could be reflecting on, or so many other important concepts, and care economy and well-being economy and donut economy and all these things. So I just yeah, I would open it up to you to reflect on these debates as well.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I think that the metaphor of human growth or growth in nature, or that growth is a good thing, I don't think it's very relevant, and it can be even dangerous when we use it for excusing economic growth in society in terms of production growing every year by a certain percentage, which is the problem, and in fact growing exponentially. A lot of people, are Herman Daly and Richard Douthwaite, have critiqued what they call the growth imperative, or what has been called the growth imperative. And in fact, the big problem is, according to them and to others, that there is a pressure to grow inherent in the system, in the economic system, caused by the way money is passed into circulation, is created as debt, and by the way companies are forced to grow in an environment of free trade, and also the pressure to have more and more production in order, because technology always gets people out of work, sort of, so to have more employment. So I think that this is a very crucial problem, the pressure to grow, and what degrowth has also named or spoken about, at least earlier. And if the system stops growing, it may collapse because it's very unstable. And I think this is the machine I had been talking about before, and which lately I think hasn't been addressed critically enough. So I just wanted to clear up this misunderstanding.
Wendy.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I just wanted to mention also, for me, also environment. I mean, it's not only the idea of human growth, it's also we're extracting from the environment, and also colonialism is extracting both from other cultures and from the environment. Very simple statement, but it's profoundly built into capitalism and into growth. So I really feel that's the politics, and that's not an easy one to change, because we're also part of that. I mean, we're using these technologies which are totally built into it. So this is not an easy one, but for me, yeah, I mean, it is important to name it, that this is a very damaging, disastrous way of living. And I'm sorry, I mean, just maybe I'm just too simple, but how we're trying to tackle it through bureaucracies, through technologies, through governments that don't even acknowledge these things. This is what really troubles me. And obviously Trump is just one facet of that. But yeah, I think that's also the big politics is also there. And I'm not saying nobody's not political. I'm just saying, how do we deal with that, as well as doing important empirical studies and linking up all of these different contexts. That's very important work, but it's also this bigger picture, it's a messy big picture, but it's a political picture that we're dealing with.
Okay, so thank you, Wendy, and yeah, thanks for all these contributions. This is really great. Just a reminder, there will be a recording of this as well, so I think it'll be really nice to go back and chew over these issues later. So if we have 5 minutes left. I would just like to sort of, anyone who maybe hasn't spoken yet and would like to contribute something, please feel free. Lena, you just turned on your camera. I don't know if that means you want to contribute. No, okay. But Anna puts in the chat, Nadia's point about debt also reminds me of anti-essentialist Marxism. Would you like to raise this point, Anna? Or Sophie, you just turned off just please, and maybe in that.
I mean, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I just went to a conference on for the Association of Economic and Social Analysis, ASA, and that's also quite like a lively network around anti-essentialist Marxism. And that's definitely got like the critical aspect of this whole discussion covered, I think. So I think it might be very generative to sort of bring them back in a little bit more explicitly, even though at least I can't say for the degrowth, but for community economies, this is obviously like very much, community economies is built on this. But yeah, sometimes it gets lost a bit, I think, in more applied works of community economy. So I think it would be very helpful to sort of resort back to some of that original work on rethinking Marxism.
Great, thank you. And Sophia?
Me?
Yes, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say something. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I wanted to say something about you, Wendy, the thing you were saying. I have a very similar problem with the concept of degrowth in the global south. So I'm from Latin America, and I constantly work with indigenous populations. And it's quite hard sometimes it feels ridiculous to talk about degrowth or mention the concept of degrowth. In Spanish is decrecimiento. And sometimes it's quite hard to talk about these big concepts that doesn't fit the local needs, the local culture, and how can you change or create or something that it's more that has more cultural relevance to the needs. And it also happens with other concepts, like for example el buen vivir, the concept of the buen vivir. I went to a very interesting presentation about what is the problem with the concept of buen vivir, is that you create a new category and you generalize other indigenous cosmovisions, and now everything is el buen vivir, and everybody is also using the concept of buen vivir in their publications, and academics are also like extracting the concept of buen vivir and modifying it to a sometimes abstract concepts related to their own disciplines. And so we were having this discussion about how when you create a new category, sometimes you want to standardize everything, and you take the local diversity or other meanings, no? So with degrowth, for example, when you translate it into Spanish, decrecimiento, it's really quite hard to understand, like, okay, what is decrecimiento? Because different groups or ethnic groups, for example, in my country, they already have their own cosmovisions, their own epistemological systems, like mixed with ontological visions as well. And when you try to talk about degrowth, it sounds ridiculous, because they say, like, well, what is the point of this concept if that means just going back to our traditional economic systems, like exchange, the traditional agricultural system? So they don't find it necessary. Like, why do we need constant new categories? And because it seems like it's more the need of create a new trend, no? Something like a new trendy concept, and what's gonna be the next trend. So for me, that's a little bit of the challenge. How can you, like with degrowth, with the concept of degrowth, how can you adapt it or change it? Or maybe we don't need to have a global category as degrowth, but to respect local categories or definitions as well. I don't know, but Wendy, I was like in relation of what you were saying. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. Ben has to leave, so thanks for the inputs and discussion. Thank you, Ben, for being here. I really appreciate it. So yeah, we will close. Ava put a comment in, local categories, yeah, needed for translation, but there's a danger of decoupling from the praxis. I think this is a great point. Ava, you also put in, if you're interested in putting together a special issue on degrowth and diverse economies, please approach Degrowth Journal. Such an issue would be magnificent, and there's her email as well. So yeah, if anyone has ideas about steps like that, I'd be happy to try to facilitate. And the Degrowth Journal is a non-academic capitalist venue, as Ava sort of referred to it. So I think it would be a nice place for that conversation to happen. Yeah, I hope everyone feels satisfied and has had their voices heard, and has had the opportunity to speak. There's a lot of people here and a lot of voices, but I think it was really productive, and I've learned a lot. And yeah, we can stay in touch on this issue. Maybe next year at Liviane again, have another similar one, or think about a special issue. But for now, I'll just close the session and thank everyone for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice
Thank
evening,
you.
everyone.
See you at
Bye,
the next
thanks.
Bye.
And Nadia, I'll see you tomorrow, right?
Nadia, I'm here just because I want to say hello. I can hear you. I hope you're doing fine, Nadia. It's so great to see you.
Sorry, I didn't have the microphone on. Hi. Yeah, thank you for what you said. That's very interesting about when we were. I didn't realize this. So thanks. And hi.
Yeah, it's sometimes a problem that I have, because I want to start these conversations in my own country, for example.
Yeah.
And when I'm in the real world, in extreme poverty areas and with different needs, and you talk about degrowth, the whole thing, it sounds so ridiculous. I feel ridiculous sometimes for bringing it up, like decrecimiento. So and for them it's like, okay, but what's the point of having another category? Like, what is because at the end it's just like going back to our traditional systems, they say, right?
And is that what they want, or is they what they don't want? I mean, going back to the traditional system, I didn't understand.
Some of them find it valuable because it's their ancestral traditions, But most of them, of course, they live in poverty conditions and they want economic growth. They want to get out of poverty and they want more jobs and they want so it's really tricky to go in a poor village and let's talk about how to decrease
Yeah.
the crecimiento, right? So it's really tricky.
No,
But it
yeah.
will be valuable to I don't know, for example, more research about just the linguistic, like the term of the growth, right? What do other contexts or ethnic groups or people think about the just the word itself? I think you could have a lot of information about discussions around just the word, the term, the growth.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can understand that perfectly, but I was surprised that about Buen Vivir because I thought the traditional cosmologies are sort of have not been very much spoken about, and the fact that it's spoken about now, or Sumak Kafsai, or whatever you want to call it, these local cosmologies are really very valuable uh, to be discussed because they speak about harmony instead of growth and so on. I was looking at the Parque de la Papa in Peru, and I was very impressed by their cosmology. So I thought this was sort of this what we could learn from these ways of thinking about the world. So
Yeah, this presentation was fascinating because it was a critique to El Buen Vivir, and I was very impressed. I was like, oh, wow, a critique to the Buen Vivir, like really? And actually, it was very insightful because locals from South America, they were saying like, look, the problem is that you are englobing or generalizing through the concept of buen vivir to other indigenous ontologies and cosmovisions, and you are losing that diversity as well.
yeah.
And also the problem is when you create a new standardized category, it's also easier for academics or people from externals to take it and use it in their own like terms and like to commercialize it basically. So it was like pretty interesting about just to reflect on how can we be responsible with the terms and names, because the culture from the global south tends to, if you like something, you explode it and use it as much as possible and you see it as a good, right? But when you have these concepts related to ontology, for example, el buen vivir, then you need to be pretty responsible because it's also part of a lifestyle about an ontological system. And so they were basically saying that they don't like how it's changing a little bit, like the concept of buen vivir and romanticizing the things as well. It was pretty interesting.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks very much for this, Tom. I think it was really interesting, and thank you for drawing me in. I was worried that I would have nothing to say. I was glad I could go fourth or fifth because by that time something occurred. So thank you for drawing me in. And I didn't even know you had written this piece for I didn't know you had written this commentary. I was wondering, could you send it to me?
Yeah, sure. I'll send it. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. So hi, Sophie. I haven't seen you for so long. I mean, your face.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've
it's
been
so
pretty
helpful
busy,
to us.
but I'm very, very happy here in Asturias and also working a lot with this Eco Museum and Research Center. The name is La Ponte.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, we've been working in several projects and in there's a lot of
Right.
stuff to do.
Tom told me you were visiting the Isle of Lewis and the Hebrides, right?
Yeah. We have this project, the name is Culturality, it's quite big and it's for 4 years. It's at 4 million euro project, it's yeah, it's quite big, but sometimes that's the problem when you have really big projects and to organize all the partners, and it's a big mess. And also about the topic of, again, to be responsible with approaches, and because this project is about economy in remote rural areas, and it's about to support traditional economic systems like artisans, but how through artisans you can create like new networks for sustainable tourism and innovation. So for me, sometimes that's a little bit problematic, because this idea of development, innovation,
Oh
it's
yeah, I hate innovation. I really hate that word. I sort of get my hair rises when I hear it.
I hate that word. That concept, innovation and development, but whatever. So inside these big projects, you need to be critical, and I've been telling, for example, in Scotland, I've been telling them, like, look, what are we doing like with this as well? Like, we need to be very careful, because we can't design new programs with massive tourism, and instead of helping rural areas, we are being part of the problem of massive tourism and pollution and cultural appropriation and this kind of stuff. But thankfully, the team, it's quite critical. They're also working in like social sciences, in different fields related to social sciences. Some of them not at all, but it's getting there. And yeah, that's it. Like, yeah, we are very happy here in Asturias. The weather is lovely. The food is unbelievable. The food is
Well, the weather has changed. Okay, it's getting colder.
It's getting colder, but you have some. Do you heat with wood, or how do you heat your house?
We have wood and oil, so we're trying to balance both. And yeah, we will have a really plentiful supply of firewood. We just need to season it more. So we're kind of doing a
Oh,
combination.
Naya, it would be great if you can visit us with Moimer. That would be really nice.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we'll certainly plan it.
Yeah, the valley is a very interesting territory because, well, Asturias in general, they have a very strong like local identity, and there are a lot of projects. Like we had the Heritage Days or Jornadas del Patrimonio, and we invited several master artisans and initiatives of local production, and there's a lot of stuff, really interesting stuff in Asturias about that, and you will love it. It's really cool.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, it was very nice to see you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you found a good place there.
Yeah. So good luck with the book. Good luck with everything. Good luck with yeah. So I'm pleased and my regards to Moime.
Okay. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Ciao.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.